Good evening and welcome. I'm Matt Jacobs, Director of the Bob Graham Center for Public Service, and I want to thank you for taking some time out of your Tuesday evening to join us for tonight's discussion on putting sustainability into practice, looking at climate change, race, and housing. Here at the Bob Graham Center for Public Service, we're focused on promoting and developing in our students and in the broader UF community the mindset and skills necessary for effective civic engagement, public service, and public leadership. And tonight's program, we think, goes some distance in that direction. And we're delighted that you can join us for this. I want to begin by thanking our sponsors, UF's Office of Sustainability, the Center for Study of Race and Race Relations, and UF's Levin College of Law, and the Florida Climate Institute, who have all partnered with us here in the Bob Graham Center for Public Service to bring this event to you tonight. In particular, I also want to thank Marianne Burnetson, our Director of Public Programs and Associate Director of the Center, and Dorothy Zimmerman, our Communications Manager, who have also worked very diligently to put this together today. I'm going to turn it over to Hannah Uloa, who's the Communications Coordinator in the Office of Sustainability here at UF, and she's going to introduce the panel, and we'll take it from here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matt. And thank you again to the Bob Graham Center for being such excellent partners in this. I also want to thank, as Matt mentioned, the Florida Climate Institute and the Center for the Study of Race and Race Relations, as well as the various campus and community members that helped shape and inform this program. As the Office of Sustainability, we are really excited to see this series come together, and we're always looking forward to helping to foster and support collaborative efforts at the UF and in the community that generate the knowledge, the skills, and the values for contributing to a more sustainable future on our campus in Florida and beyond. And really, as the Office of Sustainability, you can approach sustainability in a lot of different ways. One of those ways is using it to approach issues through multiple lenses, and using those lenses to create more intentional, equitable solutions. So if it wasn't clear before, the past year has definitely cracked open the various intersections in a lot of environmental, social, and justice issues. And that was really the germination that started this conversation of starting this series and getting into those discussions more deeply. These issues, these intersections are really nuanced. There's a lot of layers of history and policy, but there's also a lot of opportunities for students, faculty, staff, and Florida citizens to be involved in their studies, in their research, and just in their everyday lives as citizens with some of these issues. So we're really excited to have this panel of experts here tonight. I'm going to pass it off to Sekita Grant in a second, but I just also want to quickly mention, if you have questions for the panelists, we will have time for Q&A at the end. So please use the Q&A function to submit your questions, and we'll have time to review those. But I first met Sekita Grant at the 2019 Resilient Florida Summit in Tampa, where she presented on the climate change and social and community resilience. It was a very powerful presentation, and she's now the VP of Programs at the Solutions Project, and she's a longtime advocate of equitable climate policy. And we're really excited to have her here as a moderator. So with that, I will pass it off to Sekita, and I hope everyone enjoys the discussion tonight.
Great, thank you so much, Hannah. I'm going to go ahead and assume everybody can hear me, but please, somebody can let me know if not. So yes, as Hannah mentioned, I am the Vice President of Programs at the Solutions Project. In that role, I oversee grant making, policy research, and impact strategy for more than 100 amazing frontline leaders innovating in models for a regenerative economy across the country. I'm also a very proud graduate of the University of Florida Levin College of Law for my LLM in Environmental and Land Use Law. It is with great pleasure to be a part of this panel. You all are in for a treat. Thank you to the University of Florida, Bob Graham Center, Center for Sustainability for supporting this conversation and bringing us together. The ability to hold space for this conversation at the intersection of race and housing and climate is a tremendous opportunity, and it's also a necessity. We have to do this, right? Because we're facing some significant challenges. We see the impacts that climate change is having. I don't need to preach this in Florida, I think. Intense storms, sunny day flooding, extreme heat days, there's many things going on. We're also navigating significant burden on our economic systems and our health systems as a result of us being in the middle of an international pandemic, right? So we have to, at an individual level, we're already navigating very complex intersectionality of issues. We don't have the ability to just think of one thing. So that's why these conversations are so important. And for many people, this is on top of existing socioeconomic challenges, right? And for some of us, a huge challenge is the existence of systemic racism that puts an additional huge barrier in front of people's ability to thrive. So I wanted to say a couple of things to, I think, help not shape the conversation, but provide some framing and some context. So how do we navigate all of these complexities? So one of the things that I lean into is to come with a full heart, to come with curiosity, and to come with patience. So that's my biggest advice. But I'll also note some other go-to things that I use when navigating these complex issues is to turn to local communities, turn to those who are frontline to these issues to support understanding the issues, what's going on, what are the facts, and also to source solutions. So it is my belief and the belief of the Solutions Project where I work that those who are closest to the issues, who are the ones who are best able to innovate and design the solutions and the vision for where we want to go. Another place that I turn to is data and research and science, right? To help ground us in truth and fact, and also to be able to plan, farther out in time. And so this panel has experts on data, on research, and on the community innovation and the advocacy that's happening. So let's ground a little bit in Florida. So there are a few places, I think a few other places in the United States, possibly the world, that are more impacted by this intersection of race, climate, and housing than in Florida. Florida has 22 of the top 25 cities with high social vulnerability populations at risk of coastal flooding by 2050. And experts at the University of Florida caution us that Florida's vulnerable housing crisis exacerbates social vulnerabilities to climate change significantly. And we actually have the experts here who have brought those insights to us to talk about it. So a little bit of historical context, and I'll keep it brief so that we all know when we're navigating these topics. So land use planning, as well as housing, real estate, other financial industries in the United States have a history of contributing systematically to injustices in low-income communities and communities of color and immigrant communities. So for many of you not familiar, do look up and research redlining as one example of a practice in Florida that has contributed to low-income communities and communities of color and immigrant communities experiencing more destructive land use practices and having less access to positive public and private financing opportunities. So we'll talk a lot about this. Just to note that studies have also shown where natural disasters and recovery efforts have been found to actually widen wealth gaps and widen, especially on the basis of race, education, and home ownership, right? And this has occurred in Florida, and we'll hear more about this. So you'll start to learn from this panel how everything intersects. So enough from me. Our panelists today are some of the many leaders in Florida who are thinking and working at this intersection between race, housing, and climate change. Without further ado, I'm going to turn to the panelists. And if we can, from the panelists, start with your brief introduction and also your personal theory of change. How do you function in this space as kind of some introductory remarks and to help us get to know you a little better. So let's start with Cleary.
Thanks, Sekita. Good evening. I'm Cleary Larkin. I am an architect and a planner and a historic preservationist. I serve as an assistant scholar at University of Florida in the School of Architecture and in the Florida Institute of Built Environment Resilience. I currently lead a program called Florida Resilient Cities Initiative. We are working with communities across the state to help build resilience. Our first project is in Port St. Joe, which is a small town on the Panhandle that was hit by Hurricane Michael in 2018. My theory of change, since I am a historic preservationist, I think a lot of people think that I don't believe in change, but actually I think preservationists tend to manage change more than try to stop it. And you know, we do a lot of work with physical built environments, buildings and neighborhoods. But for me, those buildings and neighborhoods aren't worth saving if there's not a community in place to give them significance and meaning. So for me, change is really protecting those communities and helping them to build resilience and adapt to change because we know it's going to happen, especially as we see it here in Florida.
Great, thank you, wonderful. Pia.
Hi everyone, thank you for joining us today. My name is Pia Palomino. I am a community organizer from Family Action Network Movement, a nonprofit organization based in Little Haiti in Miami. At Family Action Network Movement, we provide services to low-income families. We provide them with immigration services. We provide them with educational services. We provide them with any sort of advocacy services. My role is to really connect with the community and educate them on issues of environmental justice. I work on issues of climate gentrification. I work on issues of sea level rise and food justice. And for me, I guess my theory of change would be really just building relationships. I think that once you develop relationships within your community and you listen to the needs of your community, you're really able to identify the key factors that, you know, help in building a better society for all. Thank you.
Thank you, beautiful. Anne.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. My name's Anne Ray, and I'm with the Shimberg Center for Housing Studies here at UF. We're part of the College of Design, Construction, and Planning in the Rinker School of Building Construction. And the Shimberg Center was founded in 1988 to serve as the state's affordable housing research arm. We were founded by the state legislature. And among other things, we offer the Florida Housing Data Clearinghouse, which is the project I coordinate. And that's a free source of online information about affordable housing needs and supply in cities and counties and statewide in Florida. We also do a statewide rental market study for Florida Housing Finance Corporation every 3 years to look at affordable housing needs across the state and among different special needs communities. And we've always focused on housing and ... So housing and land use and transportation, housing and health, housing and sustainable construction, and really most recently, housing and climate change. Again, we have a very strong focus on the state of Florida, and as Sekita was saying, there's really no place more affected and more affected more immediately by climate change than Florida. This is not theoretical, we're dealing with this now. And so we look about how we build resiliency into the affordable housing stock, how we think about equity and disaster response in a state that's been hit by many major hurricanes in the past few years. I would say as a theory of change, you know, starting as a houser, I really go back to the goal of the National Housing Act back in 1937 and going forward, which was decent, safe, and affordable housing for every American. So this very universal goal that in some ways has, you know, we've learned a lot and done a lot, and in some ways has gotten farther out of reach as housing's become more expensive and really become unhinged from what people earn or what people in fixed incomes can pay. And so I, on the one hand, keep in mind this big universal mandate that everybody have decent, safe, affordable, and now I think resilient housing. And at the same time, the way we go about that is through local implementation and through building local affordable housing systems that include a continuum of affordable homeownership opportunities, affordable rental housing, and supportive housing for people with special needs. I think that, you know, in the history of America, race has always been intertwined with housing, and you really can't talk about housing and housing needs in America without talking about race. You know, starting with redlining that grew out of the very efforts from that 1937 Housing Act that was designed to provide affordable housing for everyone, through segregation, through now gentrification on the one hand in neighborhoods, disinvestment in others. So I really think that we always need to be thinking about race and equity as we build toward affordable housing. And the future of this, of course, really requires that climate resiliency. So for me, it's just impossible to separate these three issues.
Great, thank you. Thank you. Zelalem.
Hi, everyone. I'm Zelalem Adefris. I'm the Vice President of Policy and Advocacy at Catalyst Miami. Catalyst Miami is an economic justice nonprofit based in Miami-Dade County, Florida. We work focusing on issues in communities in Miami-Dade County, Florida. And similar to FOM, PIA's organization, we have a dual arm. Direct services is something that we do to address immediate needs, as well as policy and advocacy, community engagement, and a whole lot of other programs. So I could go on for years. You know, I came on to staff, I think about 5 years ago now, when the organization was kind of realizing how much climate change impacts the community members that we work with every day. And so I came on to build out our climate justice programming, and now I oversee all of our policy and advocacy and leadership training work, which in addition to climate change, housing, we found was the #1 issue across Miami-Dade when we asked the different key neighborhoods about their priorities. So happy to be here today and really passionate about this intersection. I think this intersection is where I spend most of my time every day. My theory of change, well, when it comes to climate change, addressing climate change, and particularly in Florida, I believe that the challenges presented by climate change, in particular to our state and to South Florida, are really unique. There's some things, I don't know, that we've faced before as a modern society, and we have a really diverse population as well, you know, across the entire state. And I really have a hard time believing that even a very intelligent but relatively small group of people could represent all of the multifaceted solutions that we need to put forth to really make build a better economy and a safer environment for everyone. So all that to say, I really think we need a very participatory and collaborative policy process that welcomes all sorts of constituents and residents of our state in order to really truly address this issue. So that's something we work on in our organization.
Excellent. That in itself was, all those intros were so powerful. And I learned a lot, so I'm sure folks learned a lot in the audience as well. Thank you for sharing. So just a heads up to the audience, we have a little bit of a flow here. So we're gonna start with a question or two that's on the context and kind of the problem, I would say, a little bit more, and then getting into solutions. So we do leave you all with some solutions and some local example, around what's happening in Florida and how it's impacting even outside of the state. So let's start with a question about how can, if the panelists can provide specifically how climate change, and I'm gonna merge two questions, how climate change and separately or related, systemic racism. So systemic conditions are really critical. Systemic racism show up in your work. And if you have any specifics on that, or if you'd like to speak more generally to it, but how climate change shows up in your work, as well as how does systemic racism show up in your work. So let's start with, I'll mix it up. Let's start with Pia.
So I find that, climate change and systemic racism, they are both kind of, play behind the scenes. A lot of community members that I work with don't understand, the impact of climate change, or they don't understand the impact of systemic racism. These are two separate issues that have been, building up in the background, and they come out in different ways. And many of the community members, many of the low-income families that we work with aren't even aware of, climate change or of the systemic racism that has been in place in their community. So our organization is based in Miami, and in Miami, we have such a long history of, systemic racism. You touched upon redlining. This was a huge issue. For example, in Miami Beach, most brown and Black communities weren't able to buy or rent property on the beach. And so they were forced into, disinvested areas with, maybe pollution or any other environmental factors that they didn't want to deal with. So they kind of pushed people, and that in essence became the community that I work with now. Little Haiti is where, our organization is based in, and it's made up mostly of Haitian descendants. And, slowly it's getting a little bit more, Cuban and other Hispanic descendants, but it's mostly, low income people of color that have lived here for 30 plus years. And so what started as kind of a community where very disinvested, there was very little parks and areas for them to grow, has now kind of flourished after all this time into a very culturally rich neighborhood. And what I found that right now, one of the main issues tying it back into housing is that now, as we talk about climate change in Miami, one of the biggest issues we talk about is sea level rise. So as sea level rise, as the impacts get worse, developers who still want to invest money in Miami are looking at places of higher ground and higher elevation. And Little Haiti and other low-income communities such as Liberty City and Overtown, they are now almost 10 feet above sea level compared to Miami Beach. And so now developers are starting to get an interest in these communities. And so with this, it comes education and knowledge, because a lot of these communities are getting pushed out and displaced. And, I live in this community as well. And, my neighbors have moved and the rent is increasing. So all of these problems are starting to affect people. And part of what my work is to educate them on, the background and how this came to be. So when we see rent increasing or we see problems of gentrification in my community, a lot of people are only focused, oh, why is this happening now? They don't really seem to understand the long systemic, issues that have been in place. And now climate change is kind of accelerating this, and it's bringing more people, into this community. They're coming in and they're trying to, gentrify it, build beautiful sky rises, when for the longest history, it's been disinvested, and people are starting to get confused. But that's why education and outreach and building these relationships is so important.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for even taking us into some solutions. I love kind of you bringing in that importance of education. And I think it's at the community level, and it's government everywhere, having these moments of education so we understand the context. Zelalem, what in your work, how do you see and how do you navigate, the climate change showing up as well as systemic racism showing up?
Yeah, I think that intersection is the crux of our work. So I can give so many examples, but I wanted to actually address Frank's question, because I love that question and I can use that as an example. So we do leadership training programs at Catalyst Miami that are for grassroots community members to learn about different issues and, more importantly, become neighborhood leaders and advocates on those issues. So as we started our climate program several years ago, heat was the #1 climate impact that everyone that resonated with people, and the one that when we mentioned it, people were like, okay, yeah, I can see that. I can see how the temperatures have gotten hotter over the past 30 years or over my lifetime in Miami. And we see that now. It's the hottest year in Florida history almost every single year that I've been living down here. That is like our biggest climate impact. And not only is it outdoor heat, which I can talk about, but indoor heat as well. So you asked about energy, the intersection between energy, housing, and racial justice. Low income people in general spend more, they have an energy burden, which means they spend more of their income on utility bills, and specifically electricity bills, than their wealthier counterparts. This is due to a lot of systemic injustice around employment, and a lot of history I could rant about forever, but in economic, having less income, but also because of our poor housing stock, that a lot of folks are relegated to living in or living with slumlords that refuse to patch up the big hole in the wall or the thousands of cracks that end up being a huge hole in your wall. So you end up having to run your AC, at least here in Miami, more than you would necessarily if you had energy efficiency or home improvement programs. So I think like for us, like energy was like the #1 issue we wanted to work on, because with all of the community members that we work with, their energy bills really impact them monthly, make it hard for them to make decisions between, like especially with COVID when we're quarantining. I can't tell you how many times I've seen and how unfair it is that people have to make decisions about like whether it's too hot to quarantine in their house when we're supposed to be doing that, whether they can like afford medication or keep running their FPL bill since we're in the house all the time and running it, and families are learning in the house and all of that. So, and then of course, energy and our rampant use of fossil fuels is what's fueling our climate crisis as well. So it's just, all these things are so unfair and unjust, and end up impacting people in their pockets and their health. And that's really, where the intersection of our work is.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for providing some specific examples and covering a question from the audience. Excellent. So I'm wanting to pivot a little bit, starting to pivot into solutions. So based for Cleary and for Anne, as you've heard the outlining of some of the issues, the intersectionality, where climate change shows up, where systemic racism shows up, as you're approaching your work around research, right? And coming as researchers, coming to help to understand data and break down data, can you tell us a little bit more about why your work is specifically well suited to address some of these issues, or at least learn and help us understand some of these issues, and specifically how you work with communities to do your research and collect your data? What does that relationship look like? So how your work is specifically set up to interact and kind of engage on the intersectionality of these issues, as well as how do you work with communities in your work? And so maybe Anne, can we start with you?
Yeah, sure. So So we have a pretty specific role, or our center does as a data provider. And we provide information about housing trends. So what's happening to housing costs, rents, and home prices. We keep a database of all the subsidized rental housing in the state, and we track that very closely. We look at demographics and how they're changing, and how different groups, what their housing needs look like and how those differ. And we're fortunate to do that as a partner with a state agency so that we can provide a lot of custom information and technical assistance. And for me, it's my favorite part of my job to be able to provide that information to community groups and to people who are working on the ground, and and to be able to do that for free. So part of it from a technical perspective is just leveling the playing field. So where organizations and community organizations that want and need data have the same access to that information as somebody who has who has some business office that can pay for it. So that's really important to me, is that the equity and the provision of information. The other thing, maybe thinking back on what Zelalem was just talking about, is learning and thinking, thinking in our own work how we bring more of an equity perspective into this, again, looking at housing, but also how that intersects with climate change and race. And something somebody said early in my career that I've kept in my mind throughout and try and think about as I'm working with people in the community, is that we waste a lot of time and cause a lot of grief by trying to figure out who does and doesn't deserve, say, housing, and making all these little distinctions. And that comes up all the time in climate work, for instance, disaster response. Was your house damaged by the storm? Did it have deferred maintenance beforehand? Well, if so, if you already had a hole in the roof, we can't help you after the storm because you should have fixed it first. Well, why wasn't the house fixed in the first place? Often that's an equity issue. So I think while we provide that information and help people sort of focus on very specific needs, I think we think about I really hope that we think about how to zoom out and again, come back to that universal perspective that I talked about in my introduction, that, with all of these very specific needs that we can designate and we can help communities understand, there's also just a universal need for safe and affordable housing.
Powerful. Awesome. Thank you so much. All right, Cleary.
All right. Well, I want to talk a little bit about a community that I'm working with right now. It's North Port St. Joe. This is the historic African-American community within the city of Port St. Joe. And part of our process at Florida Resilient Cities is to just start with communication. And that means holding workshops, listening to the community, listening to their stories, their values, what their needs are, what their challenges are, how they view their community, what are their strengths and weaknesses, where are those opportunities. And from our initial workshops, we pull what we call project champions. So for example, within Port St. Joe, over the past 18 months, we had 7 small research projects working with the community. And North Port St. Joe has been a project champion for 3 of those. So it's been really great to work with them. They have a project area coalition. They basically do for themselves. They have so many projects, ideas, visions for how to revitalize their neighborhood and their community. What we've found out along the way is that Port St. Joe was, historically a mill town, developed in 1920s as a paper mill town. And the area of North Port St. Joe was the neighborhood adjacent across the street from the mill, where housing for the African-American mill workers were built. And you see this in a lot of places, divided from the rest of the city by the railroad tracks, built on and over a creek. More housing was built adjacent to and on top of, a wood chipping pile from the paper mill, and chemical companies were starting to be developed around the neighborhood in conjunction with the paper mill. So there's this really long history of environmental racism that has happened there. And when you talk to the project champions and you talk to your stakeholders, you start to hear these stories. So for me, the research is qualitative. I love hearing the stories from people. And we didn't know that the creek that ran under Northport St. Joe caused rising damp in houses. It caused settling foundations. We didn't know that there was a long history of public health issues. But one day we sat down with one of our project champions and I said, show me on a map where are the houses that flood. So we had Google Maps up and he was like, oh, that's so-and-so's house and that's so-and-so's house and they have water here and there. So using that sort of qualitative information in conjunction with the data that Anne and Shimberg have provided for us, it's such a great interdisciplinary way of working to really get at the truth of what's happening on the ground in these places.
Yes, I love that. Thank you. Yeah, both of you bringing forward these examples of how one to collect and work with data that is really grounded in community voice and vision and centers some of these communities that are most impacted, and even kind of getting a sense of how this might be useful in policy and other spaces that are maybe currently counterproductive for what we're trying to achieve. But perhaps with some of this additional information, they could be more productive. Great. Okay, so let's deepen kind of around the solutions. So thinking about, and some of you have covered this a little bit, but what are the ways that we can start to center communities that are most impacted by these issues, that we can start to ensure that people say being at the table, I want to say even leading some of this and helping to really lead the vision, right? And some of y'all have touched on this, but curious to hear from you all. I see super nods from PS, so I'm going to start with you again. What are some of those techniques that can be used and strategies to really center frontline communities?
Yeah, so that is one of, my most important things that I do as a community organizer is really connecting and getting to know with the community. And, sometimes it is a little bit difficult, but one of the strategies that we use is, one-to-one conversations. So what my organization does is we have canvassing days, maybe once or twice a week, where a group of us, go door knocking and, try to engage the community, especially around certain issues. So I'll share a little bit of an example. Right now, we are working closely with this neighborhood in Little Haiti that has been an affordable housing unit that it has almost 500 units. So it's a big complex. And so it is considered affordable housing compared to the rent of Miami and Wynwood and everything that's rising. It's one of the lower rents that we can find. And so the owners have decided to basically, demolish the property and build a skyrise in its place. And so all the residents that right now are maybe paying $1,200 for a 2-bedroom for their families are now in jeopardy of being displaced. And, the future of these like 28-story sky rises compared to Miami will be at least, $3,000 in rent. So what we are trying to do at my organization is really develop a relationship with these impacted people and uplift their voice. As a community organizer, I consider myself kind of like the glue that's holding this together, that's bringing these people to the table, because at the end of the day, they are the ones whose stories and impact can make a difference. So we do canvassing, we do door knocking, we do phone banking, any way to really educate and engage. And, sometimes the feedback is amazing. Sometimes we have conversations with residents that are so moved and are, scared for the future of their families that immediately they want to get involved. And so we really kind of create these groups where we train individuals to be kind of like organizers themselves and to speak and then, you know, kind of pass the torch, and that way building a bigger coalition of people. And so, you know, our goal really is to you know, give these people the voice and the strength to use their voice, so that then they can go in front of, you know, the city commission or the planning and zoning board and say, you know, we want affordable housing. Our main concern is how with the coronavirus pandemic, everyone's main concern is, you know, how am I going to pay rent when it comes to it, when it comes to your job being cut, when it comes to, you know, not having steady income. That's what people go to. How am I going to pay my rent? And so really uplifting these, making these connections, uplifting these voices, pushing them, you know, to speak towards policymakers, to speak towards the developers themselves, and then kind of building like a community agreement, a community benefits package, where, you know, we want to make sure that the community knows that we're not against development. We are not against, you know, bringing money into a continuously disinvested community. What we want is to make sure that the community themselves are taken into consideration, and their needs and, you know, what their worries and concerns are being addressed. So really bridging that gap between, you know, developers and politicians that, you know, want to make policies, and really making sure that the impacted people are at the table. And a lot of them, you know, they want to be heard. It's just, you know, they might not have the resources, they may be scared. A lot of the times they just need that push, that one conversation where it's like, you know, we're listening and making sure that they know that their voice matters. And I feel like once, you know, that comes in front of any politician, any developer, they see that impact and that connection, it really helps in changing the narrative, so it is not just one-sided.
Thank you for that. That was like a nice, solid, you know, community organizing 101, and really helping us understand how to build power in that way. Cleary, you also look like you had some thoughts perhaps on this question.
I was actually reading a couple of other questions as I was listening, because I think the
and if you want to address, we are going to pivot in about 8 minutes to the audience Q&A, but I think we can, let's flow with the conversation. So if there's anything there you want to address, please do.
Yeah, I was just actually thinking about, you know, we have Pia and Zelalem, you know, working in Miami, which we all know is a great example of climate work. And they have so many resources in Miami. And I'm always kind of struck by this idea of, you know, we need resources in smaller communities and rural communities. And just today was thinking about two of our projects. One is Port St. Joe again, but then we are also working in Jacksonville with two nonprofits, LISC, and which is a national nonprofit, but they have an office in Jacksonville, and Groundwork Jacks, which is doing, you know, Emerald Trail and creek restoration. So there are all of these cities that have nonprofits and administrative capacity to help in cities. And I think a lot about if the North Port St. Joe PAC just had, you know, an executive director that was a paid position, you know, and how can we build that sort of administrative capacity in rural areas where, you know, some of our smaller panhandle counties don't even have, you know, regional nonprofits that could come over and help, or the education that Pia is talking about, you know, the educating residents on how to advocate for themselves through the public hearing process, which is way overcomplicated. So just thinking a little bit about that as a solution, you know, the ability to build administrative and social capacity in smaller rural places as well.
I think maybe if I could jump in for a second too, that one thing this conversation brings up is what the role of people who work in a university should be. So getting back to the question of, how you place communities forward, it's a combination of providing that expertise and information, but doing it with humility. And the university and communities that don't have that kind of people infrastructure, just don't have enough people doing all these different kinds of jobs that Cleary talked about. That's a place where a university can fill in, so not, to produce a paper or to produce research subjects, but really to provide that information infrastructure, because universities have such people resources in addition to expertise.
Yeah,
I can jump in on that note, because one of the things I wanted to mention is, and I can give an example, like I once had a university professor tell me that community members cannot work on policy because, policy is a certain way and it's too complicated. And I just found that my response was like, well, we're doing it right now. And I just think if you, have the capacity or the influence or are doing this sort of work on these margins, to please open up your processes and to make things a little bit more, a lot more collaborative, if I can choose, because I think it's asking people what is this a problem and how do you think we should solve it, which is basically policy. And at the end of the day, do these make sense to you? Do you think these will work or not? Is a really important process that I think a lot of people that are directly impacted don't ever get welcomed into. So, that's a lot of our work, and I think we are really lucky to have such an ecosystem in Miami. But like Anne said, I think if folks, sorry, I'm reading the comments and that's really funny, Jason. So I got distracted, but like Anne said, I think that could be a good solution.
Yes, incredible. I love it. And you all are all kind of collectively pushing us or encouraging or showing us the value of just more participatory ways of being, of conducting research, of conducting policy, and how to have that really productive engagement with community. So thank you. So we have just a few more minutes of this part, and then we're gonna move over into the Q&A from the audience. So what I wanted to do is give an opportunity for each of the panelists to kind of leave us with a call to action. So what is your suggestion for ways attendees can take action on these issues, whether it's in their studies, their careers, or in their everyday lives? And, oh, that's right, let's see.
Okay.
To start. Somebody start, yeah, Anne, go ahead.
Sure. So, I think there's two things happening right now that really give us an opportunity for action. One is that there's so much more attention to affordable housing issues at the local issue than I've seen really over the past 2 or 3 years. More going on in local government and county government. They're not waiting anymore really for the state or the feds. They need resources, they need money from the state and federal government to build affordable home ownership opportunities, to build affordable rental housing, to build supportive housing. But cities and counties are really taking this on themselves. And in Hillsborough County, for instance, where Tampa is, it was a group of citizens showing up to county commission meetings over and over and over again and advocating for low-income rental housing and for the county to spend its own money. And the county eventually came around and they pushed the Board of County Commissioners to do that. So local affordable housing advocacy over the past few years has really been having a moment. And the other thing that's happening right now is because of COVID, suddenly we're willing, and the feds on down are willing to try solutions that affordable housing advocates have been calling for years. So more rental assistance, opening up hotel rooms rather than congregate shelter so that people can be safely off the streets and out of congregate settings, an eviction moratorium, and again, the rental assistance that would come along to so that people can pay their back rent. So there's also this opportunity to say, hey, if that works during a time of COVID, can that work for the affordable housing needs we had coming into this pandemic and will no doubt have coming out of it? So continuing to be advocates for those strategies where this is a demonstration to show that they work.
Thank you for that perspective. All right, Pia, what would you like to leave folks with? Call to action.
Yeah, I mean, like Anne just mentioned, really, showing up is the most important thing. And that can start by having a conversation. I feel like in the time of COVID, so much has happened that, a lot of people that, maybe weren't engaged are starting to pay attention to all these issues. And so what I have found is really just having a conversation with your friends, with your family, can open so many doors to getting involved and to getting, your neighbors involved. I feel like once, these conversations are had and, you have a group of friends who are involved in the same issue, it's so easy to find like a local organization and just, start volunteering or educating yourself any kind of ways. But for me, what I found is having these conversations is the best way to start.
Definitely. Love that. Zelalem.
I love all of that. And I have like two very things you should do right now sort of things. One is our organization, Catalyst Miami, is having our Poverty Solutions Summit next week. It'll be virtual and you're all invited to talk about, to learn about solutions from across the country to a lot of these issues and others that I assume a lot of participants on this call really care about. I can drop the link for that in the chat. We'd love to have you register. And then the other thing, it's just on my mind and there's a deadline, but I don't know how many people have heard of House Bill 1 in Florida. In the Florida legislative session. It's a bill to suppress First Amendment rights and protests in particular. We know that tenants, environmental advocates use protests as a really powerful tool to move action. And with the passage of this bill, there could be significant and increased jail sentences for exercising that First Amendment right and other nasty things that are in it. So they're having a hearing on it tomorrow at 4 p.m. I can try to drop all the emails in the chat, but if you can, of the people in that committee, but it's several legislators from across the state, be really important if y'all tonight could just send an email to them, saying, to protect our First Amendment rights, or if you protest or do any sort of advocacy, why that's important to you.
Wow, awesome. Thank you for flagging that. Cleary.
Well, I had listed everything that everybody else has already said, because I think talking to people one-on-one is so important. Educating yourself. I have been so thrilled to see people picking up The Color of Law or Ibram X. Kendi's books, books that I've read as a scholar, and then my friends that are not in academia are reading. And so I think the events of the past year have really kind of broadened the general public's interest in these topics, which is so exciting to me. I think the idea of volunteering and of protesting and advocating is so critical. I volunteered for the first time this year to be a poll worker during the election in November, and I learned so much about the process, and I saw with my very own eyes how much work we have to do. So I think about your skills and what talents you have and how you can put those to use, and pick something and go for it.
I love that. I love it. Okay, awesome. So let's quickly transition into the audience questions, which are amazing and plentiful. So I don't think we're going to get to everything. Hopefully there's access to panelists maybe after this. I don't know through Hannah or Marianne, if there's a way to kind of keep this conversation going, because I'm reading through and all of these are really great. So let's start with, I'm just going to kind of go in order in the Q&A window. So given the various this is from Andy, given the various environmental crises that Miami faces as a city on the coast, is it fair to say that the city is a sort of indicator species or a canary in the coal mine for how other cities in the state will react to the ecological crisis? And as I go through this, let's just have one person provide a relatively brief response. I'll say really quickly, going against what I just said, that as we navigate this, to have awareness, and Cleary, I know you could speak to this, that there are differences, and to acknowledge that there are kind of rural spaces that are navigating these challenges in similar and different ways, you know, as well as how bigger cities like Miami are navigating. But if Pia or Zelalem would like to answer the question of kind of how Miami's experiences might apply to other cities in the state, and if there are examples of where that's already kind of, you're already seeing those connectivities happening.
I can take a stab at it. I don't know if Miami's actions will be will tell how other places are going to act. But I would say, like, for me, I actually look for the problems or the things we might see. I actually look to the Florida Keys because they're like really experiencing this first. You know, after Hurricane Irma, the Florida Keys, that was basically it for their affordable housing stock. And so most of their workers are now being shipped in from Miami-Dade County every day on a bus. You know, Key West is about 4 hours by car. And so that's a climate impact and a housing impact. And it just goes to show, if you don't invest in affordable housing, you know, housing for your workforce, which there's, you know, a lot of hotels and such, you know, it just says so much to me, like for the future of Miami and what we need to watch out for. So I hope other cities across the state will be even more reactive than Miami has been. I can tell you they're much more focused on adapting to climate change than they have been in mitigating or actually addressing greenhouse gas emissions. I think this is really dangerous because at a certain point, we can't adapt our way out of you know, 30, 40, 50, 60 feet of sea level rise. So I think it's really important for us to get to the root of the problem and have, you know, bold political leadership. So that's my attempt at the question. I hope that's helpful.
I think so. That's awesome. Thank you. So so there's a question about policy mechanisms from Donna. I would like to hear about the actual potential for the use of policy mechanisms such as eminent domain or those that encourage voluntary abandonment of housing in climate risk areas. So anybody want to talk to some of the policy mechanisms you've seen that are helping to address some of these issues? Does anybody want to?
I don't know, Cleary, I don't know if you've seen any of that in your work. I know that it's been really difficult and slow, even when there are resources available for people to relocate from places that have flooded over and over and over again. It seems like so far, you know, even the limited mechanisms we haven't caught on that much. So I don't know how much out there is systematic.
The only thing that I was thinking about is that I do know that there are some buyouts happening in certain cities, but I'm really, you know, it's at the municipal level, so I'm really not familiar with that funding strategy, where the funding comes from, how they decide where it goes. Do they invest in relocation? How do they decide on relocation? I'm not familiar with all the details of it, though.
Okay. All right. So, and I wanted to flag for Anne. There's a question for Rachel. I don't know if you can see the Q&A chat. That's pretty specific to you. You could answer it live if you have the ability to do that. And then I'm going to combine Equia and Vincent. Their questions are a little similar. So essentially, can you all name any major companies or governments that have been particularly good partners in this and are moving major investments to address these issues? So if anybody has any examples of that.
Well, I will just say that our work in Port St. Joe has been funded by a foundation, the Jesse Ball DuPont Fund, and they focus their work in Port St. Joe and in Jacksonville. But you know, that is really for research and design. And our goal with this is to get to a place in the project where the community can apply for grants. A lot of those grants may happen through FEMA. FEMA has BRIC funding. The DEO has grants for disaster recovery. And I think a lot of these go through the municipalities and through the counties. So when thinking about equity and justice as far as disaster recovery goes, that mission really has to be stated from the municipality or from the county, because they are the ones that are applying for those grants in order to fund green infrastructure, mitigation solutions, disaster recovery, design and planning proposals. So that's a real sort of top-down governmental process.
All right. So related, there's kind of some questions that are asking about working with government, which is kind of clear. You spoke to this a little bit, but how there has been either pushback or there's not great relationship with working with local or state or federal agencies on these issues, and if there's examples of where that is working well. So does anybody want to?
I'll kind of, you know, because I saw it says, you know, what sort of support would you like to receive from federal and local governments? So like Cleary said, my nonprofit as well is funded through grants. We don't receive any money from federal or local governments. And then the second part, it says, do you think politicians should prioritize solving these crises, or do you think that nonprofits will be able to create long-term change on their own? So I do not think that, you know, on their own nonprofits will, you know, create change. I think it has to be like an intersection. We do try to reach out to our politicians as much as we can and develop relationships. Luckily, you know, the executive director of my organization has been an advocate for, you know, immigration and all these different issues in Little Haiti for so long. So, you know, she's well respected and she's able to get meetings with politicians and they hear us out. Sometimes, you know, unfortunately, you know, it's more just like hearing us rather than aiding us. But at the end of the day, I think it's really important to develop these relationships with politicians. I know a lot of people have a bad taste in their mouth of, you know, government entities and they kind of tend to look down upon, you know, especially with a lot of the neglect that they may have felt during this pandemic. But I try to stay positive and I try to say, you know, at the end of the day, it's more important to try to build a relationship, to educate yourself on new policies or bills that may be passed, because at the end of the day, you know, the government is still going to pass these bills that are going to affect you directly. So it's better to try to create these relationships and create spaces where they do see you as a sort of voice for the community. So, you know, I think the real change can be made at the intersection in these, you know, conversations between impacted people and, you know, government and politicians that do care. I don't think that all of them may have the best intentions, but I think there is some leeway, and we do have some good people out there that want to make change for the community.
Nice, perfect. Okay. There's so many good ones. I'm like, we're not going to get to all of them. Actually, I'll ask the panelists, are you seeing any questions right now that you're like, I really want to answer that?
I'd like to hop on this one about Gainesville.
Yeah.
I think
Okay.
that's relevant.
Yes, yes.
So I don't know
Definitely.
if from Anna, while Gainesville isn't as impacted by rising sea levels and climate change as coastal cities like Miami, we have a huge affordable housing crisis and gentrification issues. So how does a place like Gainesville deal with these? I think there's two things. One is that, again, we think about how do we build our affordable housing supply, and it keeps coming back to the same, our combination of affordable rental housing, supportive housing, and affordable home ownership opportunities. And part of that is building in long-term or permanent affordability into, say, a subsidized rental housing development, or placing more land into a community land trust so that the housing on it remains permanently affordable. So part of it is the same strategies that everybody needs to do to build their affordable housing supply. But also, I think we are going to be affected by rising sea levels and climate change, because, just as people are moving from Miami Beach to Little Haiti, where are people in coastal communities going to start moving when sea level rise starts affecting more of their housing? They're going to be moving to Orlando, they're going to be moving to Gainesville. Sometimes I wonder if we're going to have this big Orlando, Ocala, Gainesville metropolitan area eventually. And so it's time to think about how we preserve affordability in our housing long-term or permanently now, before that population pressure happens.
Can I just tack on to that real quick, being another Gainesvillian? I think the language that we use to talk about affordable housing sometimes has a stigma with it to the general public. And so any sort of public process has to be very clear about what it is that, let's say the city is looking to do, or the county is looking to do, because, we hear affordable housing, and it may mean one thing to one person and another to another. So I think this sort of education of the terminology and what affordable really means. I mean, when you start looking at the actual percentages of salary that meet the affordability criteria, I think people would actually be in shock, that so many people cannot make that happen. So I think that clear communication in Gainesville, I'm thinking specifically, is really important. And also that, yes, the climate migration, I think Alachua County is already preparing for that. So starting to discuss what is this going to look like in the next decades to come.
Wonderful. Anybody else had their eye on a question?
I really liked Hannah's question about what Anne said about the contradiction between this false dichotomy that people deserve, people are deserving of housing or not for arbitrary reasons that we make up. But I think I might be like making up my own, reading into this question too much. But it says, how do we combat the idea that on multiple scales, while keeping in mind that cost is a huge inhibitor to resource access? And I don't know if I'm reading this correctly, but just one thing I wanted to mention. We've been doing work on municipal budgets for a long time at Catalyst, like looking at what our governments are actually investing in, and like doing advocacy around those things. And it's just really amazing, like in multi-billion-dollar budgets. Miami-Dade County is pretty big, so at our county level, at our school board level, what goes unfunded and what is absorbing most of the funds. I think we're actually this nation in particular is very resource rich, and distribution is a huge issue. So I just highly recommend and maybe I know it's not an easy ask, but take a look at like those processes that your municipalities have and what they're prioritizing, because I think it's not you know, there's a lot of opportunity in working with what we do have.
Sweet. Well, this has been amazing. I think we're at time, right? I think so. Yeah, we're at time. Unfortunately, this conversation, I feel like we were just getting warmed up, you know, and so it really speaks to the expertise on this panel and the relevance of this topic and the complexity, but also, you know, these are things we can handle, we can navigate them. So I want people to leave hopeful. And thank you so much for the panelists for participating and the amazing questions and comments. I do want to shout out any students that are with us today. There was a great, Andrew, you had a great question about particular career path, what everybody's career path was. We don't have to get time to get into it, but definitely I'm available to chat. And if others, you know, I love those questions. And Yesenia as well has time. She's a graduate, a senior in the geology program at UF and is looking to do more work in this area. So maybe there's ways that we can connect. Yes, there's always space for, you know, bright, you know, folks in academia to be supportive. So just wanted to drop those and I'll hand it, I'm not sure who I'm handing it over to. I should look at this.
Thanks, Sekita. You can hand it over to me. I'm back.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, just to basically reiterate what Sekita just said, I feel like this conversation scratched the surface and I could probably hear from you all for another hour very happily, because I can just feel the passion and expertise in all of your answers coming through. So thank you for all of the amazing insight and examples and storytelling that you shared tonight. And thank you, Sekita, for leading such an incredible discussion. We are really looking forward to this series as a whole. And I wanted to share, before anyone starts jumping off, I wanted to share, I think, the next piece of the series, which is going to focus on climate change and public health. And a lot of that even came up in today's discussion. There were mentions of health and how this was all intersected. And I think that just speaks to how critical these intersectional conversations are in finding and implementing solutions that are good for everyone. So thank you again to everyone. I hope you have a great evening. And as was mentioned in the chat, we will do our best to try and circulate any information that was shared today and links and emails, and try and connect you with panelists that might be able to answer questions more directly. I think that's it.
Thank you.
Thank
Have
you,
a great
everyone.
evening, everyone.
Thank you so
Thank you. This was great.
Yeah,
Thank you so
I really
much.
enjoyed this. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, everyone.